Hi all, welcome. Today we're going to talk about an important and honestly brutal aspect of academic writing, how to improve your text as well as your writing style to become more concise and precise. So here are the main questions we're going to answer in this video. First, how important is it really to be concise and precise in English? And what are some main factors that cause problems here, and how can we identify them as second language or L2 writers of English especially? How can we then, of course, fix them in our own writing? Let's start out with a little opinion check. You most likely speak one or more languages besides English. So when you read in your first language, and I really mean nonfiction texts, on a scale from 1 to 5, how tolerant are you of a text using more words than necessary to say something? So, English is a language that demands most of the work to be done by the writer, not the reader. In linguistics terms in general, we can use the idea of high context or low context linguistic environments. A culture that's considered high context is one that the listener or the reader is more responsible for kind of reading between the lines and understanding a meaning that's not always directly stated. Now, a culture that's considered low context is one where generally the speaker, or in our case, the writer, is responsible for being clear and making sure the meaning is understood, and the listener doesn't have to assume that there's a lot of unspoken connotation happening that they need to figure out. Now, English as a language ranks as pretty low context, meaning that the writer is in charge of making the meaning clear and specific and easily understood. At the same time, we have a low tolerance for not understanding something immediately and clearly, and preferably before we've even finished reading it, thank you very much. And therefore, English has an especially low tolerance for wordiness and for time wasting. And you can see this also reflected in the aspects of cohesion and clarity, which I talk about in another video. As one amazing writer, Kurt Vonnegut, put it, pity the reader. Meaning that a good writer should begin with the assumption that we should honestly feel sorry for the reader who has to read our bad writing, so we'd better make it good writing. And yet, here is the real problem. Many writers just can't revise their texts to be more concise and precise. It's too hard. Well, to be more specific, they can, but it takes a fair amount of effort and practice. And did I mention effort? Another great writer, Mark Twain, said it this way, which I love. In a letter to a friend of his, he ended it with, "I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so sorry, I wrote you a long letter." And it really does take more time to be concise. But the thing is, it takes our time, not the reader's time. And that's really important, not wasting the reader's time. So that was a very not concise way of framing the topic. And with that, let's get straight to our issues. We're going to talk about 4 big issues that occur again and again in academic writing and contribute to a text not being concise or precise. Now, good writing is clear, concise, precise, and compelling. And the first issue, which is passive verbs, especially has an impact on all 4 of those aspects. Now, I'm not saying never use passive voice in your writing. That's ridiculous, honestly. And even though Grammarly might be telling us this sometimes, it's not feasible or advisable. What I'm saying is there are good reasons and bad reasons to use passive voice, so let's just take a look at them quickly. 1, we want to emphasize the action rather than the actor. 2, we want to be tactful or avoid responsibility. 3, when the actor is unknown or otherwise unimportant or assumed. 4, to be authoritative or neutral sounding. And finally, to keep the subject or the focus consistent throughout our text, especially if we've been doing any of those things above already. But a bad reason to use the passive voice would be simply because you're assuming that you always have to use it. Keep in mind that passive voice has an impact on the sentence. It takes a toll. It pushes the verb later, It can make a sentence wordier. It can come off as fairly abstract, and it also gets really repetitive. So it should be used for a reason. And by the way, passive voice might still represent 50% or more of your verb tenses in a text. That's still reasonable as long as you've considered those impacts I just mentioned. Here's our second issue. Too many nominalizations. First off, what is a nominalization? That's simply when we turn a perfectly good verb, or sometimes an adjective, into a noun. For example, the action to transfer something versus the noun phrase, the transferal of something. And boom, just like that, we have doubled our word count, and that is not necessarily good, right? So why exactly is this bad? Well, it's not that it's bad, but in English, the action, the verb, is the center of everything, center of how we understand things. When we turn our actions into nouns, they become like less powerful and more abstract. Sometimes this is the desired effect. Maybe we want to make the actor less obvious in some cases. In other words, the person or the thing doing the action, the actor. Similar to when we use passive voice verbs, we do the same thing. And this can sound more neutral or more academic. But other times it leads to these very wordy, flat sentences that are harder to read, more abstract, and definitely longer. When I say more abstract, consider this. If one phrase makes it harder to picture something in your head than another phrase, then that phrase is more abstract. When I picture transferring money in my head, I can imagine, money zipping from one bank account to another. But the transferal of money occurring, however, sounds a little more abstract and harder for me to picture. So some signs that you might want to reverb some of these nominalizations would include lots of empty verbs, because the meaning has now kind of shifted to a noun. Or too many phrases like the blah, blah, blah of XYZ, the this of that, etc., etc. And when you know there are other phrasings for these. So consider reverbing. Now, the next cause of these problems is somewhat related, and maybe it even comes from our attempt to overcorrect our conciseness problems. And it's these very long, uncrackable noun phrases that we use all too often in academic writing. These might not be so bad on their own, but when they're coming at you in a sentence, all back to back to back to back, it can get really exhausting to see the focus of the phrase and how each phrase fits with the next phrase, etc. Now, as a reader, you might know that it's a lot harder to digest these phrases the first time we encounter them in a text and we don't know what they refer to yet. So oftentimes our text will improve. We as writers, we can improve our texts if we instead use a much easier to read, but possibly more wordy, less concise phrasing the first time. And then maybe after that, we can refer to something with one of these more concise but hard to read noun phrases. For example, instead of program implementation, process evaluation, the first time I write that in my text, I might want to say something more like, we evaluated the process of implementing the program and blah, blah, blah. I could also even benefit from using some good hyphens in a phrase like this, because those at least tell us which words go together. But I wouldn't say this makes a huge life-changing difference for most readers. Okay, and here is the final and most complex cause before we stop and take a little time to practice. What we're talking about here, firing those lazy words, sounds simple on the face of it because it just means going through your text and finding shorter ways to say things, deleting unnecessary words, etc. Here are a few examples of different phrases that could be replaced with because, since, or why, just to name a few. We have some here that could be replaced with even though or although, for example. And we have several examples of phrases that have too much of that empty verb or nominalization situation. And we could tighten those up with a more precise phrasing. Now, as I said, this seems kind of simple, until we actually try to cut like 10% from our papers because they're too long, and we realize how hard this is. So let's fully acknowledge that as second language writers, this one's going to be the most difficult, the most brutal, and the most tedious aspect of being concise. But of course, it's also going to make the most difference overall. This is one where we really need to work on when cutting has to happen. And that's not a matter of opinion sometimes, but just cold, hard word counts, right? Now, if you've already done it and you're no longer able to cut entire paragraphs or sections from your work, this is where you're going to need to spend a lot of your time. And what I'm talking about here is just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, because what you don't see from these examples is that in order to really change a phrase, and therefore save words, we often have to change the entire phrasing or sentence structure grammatically also. This can be really hard. But it can also pay off much more than just clicking on that list of synonyms in Word and trying to make a more minor swap out of the words, or just trying to look for individual words to cut from our text, which is pretty slow and ineffective. So get as comfortable as you can with all the many different precise verbs that exist in English, because verbs are a great place to start. And start assuming that for any scientific sounding noun that you know, there's probably a verb that corresponds to it that might make your phrase shorter and clearer and more cohesive too. That all sounds really great, right? Hard, but great. But how do we actually do that in our own texts when it's already a struggle just to identify those issues? Well, I'll show you one way at least, by using the word search function in the corpus, which is really going to show you a nice comprehensive overview of a word that you're trying to use or use better or even replace. So I'm going to use the COCA corpus, and I'm going to do a word search, not a list search. And let's use the word requirement just as an example. Okay, requirement is a nice one because it's one of those nominalizations. And when I do a word search here, I get a nice overview of the text the word that includes things like collocates. This is really useful, especially like if I want to have a different verb, maybe something more meaningful. I also get related words, which often are going to give me similar but different parts of speech. So here's the verb require, for example, instead of requirement. That could already save me a few words. I'm also going to get some synonyms. Maybe I know how to use one of those a bit better in a more concise phrase. And I'm going to get these clusters, which are really cool. These are going to give me lots of really common clusters or phrases for that word that include two words, requirement, or requirement. So these dots represent another word in the phrase. You might have 3-word phrases, right? And so on, you can see. And then lastly, I have my concordance lines, which give me those really cool keyword and context examples. And I can at least scroll through here and see if there's anything useful, like maybe some verbs or prepositions I could use, something like that. So a nice overview of the word. And it really gives you some quick ideas on alternative phrasings, or if you want to use a different word entirely. Okay, let's try a quick practice. Revise one or more of these sentences, and I really want you to be brutal here. That means use any tricks you see to make the sentence shorter and clearer, while still capturing the intended meaning of the sentence. So go ahead, pause here, and please share your revisions in the chat or in the comments. Okay, some final takeaways here, just to sum up. In English, the burden of meaning making is really on the writer, not the reader. And in our quest to write texts that are clear, concise, precise, and compelling, we find that verbs play an especially major role in communicating our meaning. Some problems being concise and precise come from typical or even old-fashioned academic styles. Meanwhile, academic writing is really trending away from sophistication and toward clarity and accessibility and being easy to read. Now, improvements in these areas are hard, tedious, and brutal at times for the writer, but really worthwhile. It has a big impact on your text. Remember, you're not just improving the text itself, but you're also practicing your style and your skills. This is an investment in your writing skills to practice these techniques, even when you feel like your text is good enough, because that's the best way to improve. And of course, I understand we all have priorities as writers, but when you have the space and time to improve the text beyond what's expected, you're going to find a much more polished result in the end. So now, what about you and your text? I'm still adding more units to the post-writing modules in the Padlet because I think that's where most of us are at in our writing. So check those out if you're ready for that stage. And if you're ready for some feedback on your text, make sure you sign up for some feedback sessions, either with me or with your peer groups. And by the way, if you're nervous about getting feedback, don't be. In my many years of experience, I have only made like 2 people cry. That's a joke, by the way. But seriously, feedback sessions are actually a very positive and useful experience for almost all writers. So don't worry that you're just going to get a page of criticisms or red marks to correct or something. That's really not how it goes. And just quickly, here are some nice resources for you if you want a more comprehensive view of being concise and precise, and this idea of the word economy in general, which is how I like to think of it. If words cost money, how would we write? So thanks for watching this video, and be sure to add any comments or questions you have on YouTube or in the Padlet.